Exposing the false preacher. The gospel of greed. In today's world, many who call themselves men of God are not shepherds of souls, but CEOs of religious empires. Their message is not salvation, it is salesmanship. They trade in fear, promise breakthrough for a fee, and equate holiness with wealth. The pulpit has become their stage, the Bible their prop, and the people their marketplace. They do not preach sacrifice, they preach luxury. They do not carry the cross, they display car keys. They do not serve God, they use his name as a brand. Their mission is not to lead people to truth, but to keep them dependent, obedient, and financially drained. They sell hope the way empires sell dreams, wrapped in gold, powered by manipulation. This is not gospel. This is a performance, a transaction, a deception, and it must be exposed.
Carl Lentz, the pastor who mistook the spotlight for the savior. In the heart of New York City, where ambition hums through the streets and image is everything, a new kind of church rose from the noise, Hillsong NYC. There were no wooden pews, no stained hymnals, no organ echoing through dusty rafters. Instead, flashing lights, pounding drums and fog machines turned worship into a show. The air vibrated with energy, and in the middle of that glow stood one man, Carl Lentz. He didn't look like a pastor. He looked like a celebrity. Leather jackets, designer sneakers, tattoos, perfectly tousled hair. His voice carried the rhythm of a motivational speaker and the ease of someone who'd grown up under a spotlight. To his generation, he was something revolutionary, a preacher who made Jesus sound cool. He preached about grace with swagger, about purity with passion, about family with conviction, and when he spoke, people listened. His church became a cultural phenomenon, a sanctuary for the famous and the restless. Justin Bieber was baptized in his bathtub. NBA stars sat in his front row. Social media turned his every sermon into a viral quote. The media called him the rock star pastor. But every spotlight casts a shadow. Behind the stage lights and applause, something darker was growing. The image he had built, stylish, righteous, untouchable, began to crack under its own weight. In late 2020, Hillsong released a brief, cold statement. Carl Lentz has been terminated due to moral failings. The words exploded across screens. No details, just a fall from grace. But the truth, as it often does, refused to stay buried. Carl Lentz, the pastor who preached purity and family, had been unfaithful to his wife. At first, the story felt unbelievable. The man who had stood before thousands, speaking about resisting temptation and protecting one's marriage, was now caught in the very sin he condemned. But then the evidence came. Text messages, photos, paparazzi shots, and the illusion collapsed. The woman at the centre of the affair, Ranin Karim, spoke publicly. She said he had introduced himself as a sports agent, not a pastor. She said he charmed her, manipulated her, and lied to her, torn between guilt and ego, trapped in the very fame he had always claimed to despise. When she discovered who he really was, the beloved pastor of Hillsong NYC, she realized she wasn't dealing with a man of faith, but a man addicted to attention. The double life was over, and it unraveled fast. Hillsong's leadership tried to contain the disaster, issuing polished statements about accountability and forgiveness, but no press release could save them from the tidal wave of disillusionment. Hillsong had become a global empire, its music sung in stadiums, its brand spread across continents. And yet, in the middle of it all, its most visible figure had turned the pulpit into a mirror for vanity. Then came the Netflix docuseries, Hillsong, a megachurch exposed. The cameras zoomed in on the wreckage. Former members described a culture obsessed with image, where perfection was demanded, questions were silenced, and loyalty was currency. Carl Lentz, they said, wasn't the disease. He was the symptom. As one former staffer put it, Hillsong didn't create Carl. Carl was exactly what Hillsong wanted, shiny, marketable, and dangerous. For years, Lentz had used his platform to promote faith, but also himself. His Instagram feed blurred the line between ministry and celebrity branding. Every sermon was filmed like a music video, every photo carefully posed. The church became less about salvation and more about stage presence. And when fame becomes the foundation, truth can't survive the weight. Lentz eventually confessed. He posted on Instagram, "I was unfaithful to my wife and I need to step away from ministry. I'm deeply sorry." But the apology came too late. For his wife, Laura, the humiliation was public. The woman who had stood beside him at every conference now had to watch as her husband's betrayal became global entertainment. Still, she didn't leave. They retreated from the spotlight together, vanishing from social media as Hillsong burned behind them. Inside the church, the shockwaves were brutal. Attendance plummeted, staff resigned, members walked away disillusioned, unsure whom to trust. The brand that once symbolized modern Christian cool now stood as a cautionary tale about what happens when faith becomes performance. Carl Lentz had once baptized pop stars and preached about humility. Now he was being dissected by journalists, mocked by late-night hosts, and remembered as a hypocrite, a preacher who mistook charisma for character. The story of Carl Lentz is not just about lust or infidelity. It's about the seduction of fame inside the church, how easily the stage lights can blind even those who start with good intentions. He had once said in a sermon, if you build your life on anything other than Jesus, it will crumble. And crumble it did. Because while he preached purity, he was chasing applause. While he spoke of humility, he was curating selfies. While he called others to repentance, he was hiding his own sins behind 1,000 filters. The man who baptized celebrities now became a warning to them. The pastor who filled arenas now struggled to fill his own home with peace. Today, Carl Lentz has reappeared in small, quiet ways, speaking occasionally about restoration, posting about his family, promising to rebuild what was broken, but his name still carries the echo of scandal. Hillsong continues to reel from a storm of its own making, facing lawsuits, resignations, and public outrage. And through it all, the lesson lingers. The gospel doesn't need a brand, it doesn't need a celebrity, it needs truth, the very thing fame cannot tolerate. Carl Lentz's rise was meteoric, his fall was cinematic, and his story, written in the glitter and ashes of a global church, stands as a warning to every leader who dares to confuse the platform with the purpose, the crowd with the calling, the fame with the faith. He once said, "We're here to show the world what Jesus looks like." In the end, he showed the world what happens when you forget that you're not the one meant to be seen. Jimmy Swaggart, the preacher who fell from grace. In the golden age of American televangelism, one man's voice rose above them all, fiery, commanding, and trembling with conviction. Jimmy Swaggart, the Louisiana-born preacher who seemed to speak directly from the throne of heaven, became the face of faith for millions. He was a man who could fill stadiums and living rooms alike. His sermons were emotional battles between sin and salvation. His eyes burned with tears when he spoke about repentance. His gospel music swept across the airwaves, piano keys pounding, choirs rising, and the preacher's voice thundering like a storm. By the 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart was not just a pastor. He was a phenomenon. He built an empire that spanned television networks, radio stations, a Bible college, and crusades held in nearly every major American city. His reach extended into more than 100 countries. Viewers would send in money by the millions, believing every dollar would fuel a mission to save souls and fight sin. And what a message he preached. He railed against the corruption of Hollywood, the seduction of lust, the dangers of rock music, and the decay of family values. His sermons were thunderous condemnations of sexual sin. America, he would cry, has turned her back on God. But behind the television lights, the starched white shirts, and the quivering prayers, Swaggart was fighting a private war. One that he was losing. He had become what he preached against. The scandal in 1988, the illusion cracked. A Louisiana private investigator uncovered photographs of Swaggart with a prostitute in a seedy Baton Rouge motel. The story leaked first in local papers, then on national television. The man who condemned sin from the pulpit had been caught committing it in the dark. When confronted, Swaggart denied everything. He called it slander, a demonic attack. But as evidence mounted, even his closest allies began to turn away. The Assemblies of God, the powerful Pentecostal denomination that had made him a superstar, demanded his confession. And then came the moment that would haunt American religion forever. On a Sunday morning in February 1988, Jimmy Swaggart stood before his congregation, trembling, his face pale, his hands gripping the pulpit. Cameras rolled, millions watched. His voice broke as he whispered the words that echoed through the world, "I have sinned against you, my Lord." He wept openly, his tears soaking his face as his wife Frances stood silently beside him. The image was unforgettable, a man once seen as a warrior of purity, now a broken sinner before his flock. Some forgave him, others never could. The fall of an empire. In the months that followed, the fallout was catastrophic. Swaggart's television ministry collapsed. Stations cancelled his broadcasts, donations evaporated. His 8,000-student Bible college lost accreditation. And yet he tried to carry on. He insisted that God had forgiven him, that the tears had washed away the sin. He returned to preaching, his voice still trembling, his piano still thundering. But the world was no longer listening the same way. Then in 1991, another scandal erupted. Even worse. Swaggart was pulled over by California police after being seen with another prostitute. When reporters confronted him outside his hotel and asked if he had any comment, he no longer cried. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply said, "The Lord told me, it's flat, none of your business." It was arrogance dressed as faith, a defiant echo of the pride that had already destroyed him. That moment shattered whatever remained of his credibility. The Assemblies of God expelled him permanently. Former allies like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson distanced themselves, calling him a disgrace to the ministry. The aftermath. Swaggart's world shrank. The sprawling global empire that once employed hundreds was reduced to a handful of loyal followers. He sold off property to pay debts. His network of supporters dwindled. But even in disgrace, he refused to disappear. From his church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he rebuilt a smaller ministry, run by family, fueled by die-hard believers who still saw him as a flawed but chosen man of God. He launched Sun Life Broadcasting Network, where he still preaches today, mostly to an older audience that remembers his glory days. For them, he is still Brother Swaggart. For the rest of the world, he is a cautionary tale. The legacy of hypocrisy, Jimmy Swaggart's story, isn't just about scandal. It's about the dangerous fusion of power, money, and religion, and what happens when a preacher begins to believe his own divinity. He told millions to resist temptation while he secretly surrendered to it. He thundered against lust while hiding in motels with prostitutes. He called others hypocrites, then lived a double life that unraveled before the eyes of the world. And when the truth emerged, the fall was spectacular. His tears on live television became a symbol, not of redemption, but of the frailty of men who claim to speak for God. From packed stadiums and million-dollar broadcasts to isolation and disgrace, Swaggart's life stands as a warning. Charisma can mimic holiness, and faith can be twisted into theatre. Even now, decades later, the echo of his trembling voice still lingers. Open quote, "I have sinned against you, my Lord." Close quote. They were the truest words he ever spoke, but they came too late to save him from himself. Bill Hybels, the megachurch leader who fell from grace. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, a revolution in modern Christianity was taking shape. It didn't begin in a cathedral or a television studio, but in a rented movie theatre where a young, ambitious pastor named Bill Hybels gathered a small group of believers and cast a vision that would one day reshape the church world. His idea was bold. He believed faith could be fresh, relevant, and irresistible to a new generation. He wanted to reach those who had turned their backs on religion, the disillusioned, the skeptical, the modern. From that vision came Willow Creek Community Church, a place that would grow into one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the world. By the 1990s, Willow Creek was not just a church, it was a movement. Tens of thousands filled its sprawling auditorium each weekend. Millions more tuned in from around the world. Hybels became a symbol of success in ministry, the kind of leader other pastors aspired to be. His conferences trained global church leaders. His books filled Christian bookstores. His name was synonymous with innovation, leadership, and spiritual excellence. He preached about character, about honesty, about living with integrity when no one was watching. His tone was calm, his presence magnetic. To those who listened, Bill Hybels wasn't just a preacher, he was a mentor, a visionary, even a hero. But beneath the polished sermons and carefully crafted image, there were whispers. At first they were easy to dismiss, quiet rumours that never made it beyond church walls. But as the years passed, those whispers began to grow louder. By 2018, decades after Willow Creek had reached its peak, the whispers turned into accusations. Women, some who had worked closely with him, others who had looked up to him, began to speak out. They described encounters that blurred the line between mentorship and manipulation, unwanted comments, inappropriate touches, late-night meetings that crossed boundaries, moments when admiration turned to discomfort, when power became pressure. For the congregation that adored him, the claims were unthinkable. This was Bill Hybels, the man who built one of the most respected churches in America, the preacher who stood on stages teaching about integrity and purity. When the first stories broke, Hybels was defiant. Standing before his church, he denied everything. He said the allegations were lies, the result of a coordinated effort to destroy his reputation. His followers cheered. Some wept in relief, others in anger that their beloved pastor was being accused. To them, the media had it wrong. Their leader was being persecuted for doing God's work. But as journalists began to investigate, led by the Chicago Tribune, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The stories, though told by different women, shared uncanny similarities. Comments about appearance, unwanted invitations, situations where Hybels had isolated women under the guise of mentorship. Each account on its own might have been dismissed as misunderstanding. Together, they painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. Behind the glass walls and professional smiles of Willow Creek's modern campus, there had been something deeply broken. The church leadership launched an internal investigation, one that critics said was flawed from the start. Many believed the elders were too close to Hybels, too invested in the empire he had built to see the truth. When their report found no evidence of wrongdoing, several of Hybels' accusers spoke publicly, saying they had been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel like the villains in their own story. The scandal spread quickly. Churches around the world, many of which had modelled themselves after Willow Creek, began to distance themselves. Conferences were cancelled. Partner ministries quietly removed Hybels' name from their materials. In April 2018, the pressure finally became too much. Standing on the stage he had built before a congregation that had grown with him for over 40 years, Bill Hybels announced his resignation, years earlier than he had planned. His voice trembled as he said the words, yet there was still a note of defiance. He insisted he was innocent, that his conscience was clear. But the faces staring back at him told a different story, a mix of confusion, sorrow, and disbelief. Some applauders sat silently, tears streaming down their faces. It was the end of an era. His resignation, however, did not calm the storm. It only made it worse. In the weeks that followed, more leaders at Willow Creek stepped down. Elders admitted they had mishandled the situation. The church's carefully constructed reputation, built on decades of trust, innovation, and influence, began to crumble. Attendance dropped, donations fell. The community that had once stood united under Hybels' vision now fractured under the weight of betrayal. The irony was almost biblical. The man who had preached accountability and servant leadership had fallen because of the very things he claimed to stand against. He had urged others to guard their hearts, yet had not guarded his own. To this day, Hybels denies the most serious accusations. He has not faced criminal charges. But in the court of public opinion, the damage is done. He lives in quiet seclusion now, away from the spotlight that once adored him. Willow Creek still stands, but it is a shadow of what it once was. New leaders have taken the stage and the church has tried to heal, but the wounds remain deep. For many believers, the story of Bill Hybels is not just the story of one man's downfall. It is a mirror reflecting a painful truth about modern religion. Charisma can hide corruption, and success can conceal sin. Hybels once stood before thousands preaching about honesty, discipline, and humility. Now his legacy serves as a warning, a reminder that no matter how large the church or how powerful the preacher, no one stands above accountability. In the end, his fall was not just a personal tragedy, it was communal. An entire generation of Christians who once looked to Willow Creek for inspiration now look at it with sorrow, proof that even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. The man who taught others how to lead with integrity lost his own. The visionary who built one of the greatest churches in America saw it shaken to its core. Bill Hybels' story began as a triumph of faith and innovation, but it ended as a parable about pride, secrecy, and the danger of forgetting that even the most powerful pastors are still just men. James MacDonald, the pastor who preached generosity but lived in excess. In the late 1980s, when the suburban skyline of Chicago still glowed with quiet ambition, a young, confident preacher named James MacDonald started a small church with a few dozen folding chairs, a borrowed sound system, and a burning vision. He called it Harvest Bible Chapel. The mission was simple: teach the Bible with boldness. No gimmicks, no compromise, just truth. People came, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. They came to hear this tall, booming-voiced preacher who spoke with fire in his chest and authority in his eyes. He wasn't soft or sentimental. He was fierce, the kind of pastor who could shout conviction into a man's bones. By the late 1990s, Harvest Bible Chapel had become more than a church. It was a movement. Thousands filled the sanctuary each weekend. The music thundered, lights blazed, and MacDonald's voice echoed through the speakers, commanding, emotional, unforgettable. His sermons were carried on radio networks, televised across the country, and shared online to millions. To many, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a prophet for the modern age, the man who made faith feel alive again. He preached about courage, sacrifice, obedience. He demanded generosity from his followers, urging them to give until it hurt, to pour out their resources for the work of God, and they did. They gave by the millions. Families cut back on vacations to fund new campuses. College students emptied savings accounts to support missions. Every dollar, they were told, was seed sown for eternity. But as the church's reach expanded, new buildings, bigger productions, global conferences, another side of James MacDonald began to emerge. Behind closed doors, his temper was legendary. Staff described meetings that ended with shouting, slammed doors, and threats. Those who disagreed with him were branded rebellious. Those who questioned him were called divisive. He built not just a church, but a kingdom of fear. Some who tried to leave found themselves shunned or publicly humiliated. Others stayed silent, afraid that speaking out against the man of God would mean spiritual ruin. And all the while, MacDonald's image grew. He was featured in magazines, headlined conferences, and launched a global teaching ministry. He was the pastor other pastors wanted to be. But under the polished surface of sermons and soundtracks, something was wrong. Whispers began to circulate, whispers about money, about how Harvest's multi-million-dollar budget seemed to vanish into things that had nothing to do with ministry, about luxury vehicles, expensive hunting trips and private jets, about a preacher who talked about sacrifice from a stage built on donor debt. Reports surfaced that the church had taken on massive loans while still urging members to give more, always more. In public, MacDonald thundered about humility and holiness, but in private, insiders described extravagance, entitlement, and anger. Sacrifice for God, he'd say. But the man asking for sacrifice was living a life that looked a lot like indulgence. For years, charisma and momentum covered the cracks. People believed in him. The sermons were too good, the crowds too large, the vision too inspiring. No one wanted to believe it was all rotting beneath the surface until 2018. That's when the walls began to shake. Former elders and staff began speaking publicly. Investigative reporters dug deep into finances. Podcasts broadcast hours of interviews with ex-members who told eerily similar stories, stories of fear, manipulation, and cover-ups. The image of James MacDonald, bold preacher of truth, began to crumble. He wasn't the fearless shepherd anymore. He was a man surrounded by accusations of bullying, intimidation, and financial abuse. At first, he denied it all. He said he was misunderstood, that Satan was attacking his ministry. But the evidence kept piling up. Recorded conversations, leaked emails, testimonies from those who had once called him friend. By early 2019, Harvest Bible Chapel's elders had no choice. They released a statement that shook the evangelical world. James MacDonald was fired. After more than 3 decades of preaching, leading, and ruling his empire, it was over. The news spread like wildfire. Christian networks, radio hosts, bloggers, everyone had something to say. The pastor who had built one of America's biggest megachurches was out, accused of using God's money to build his own comfort. Inside Harvest, the reaction was chaos. Some cried openly, some refused to believe it. Others felt betrayed, angry that their offerings and loyalty had helped fuel a system that now looked corrupt. Attendance plummeted, donations dropped, entire ministries collapsed. MacDonald tried to fight back, giving interviews and claiming he'd been wronged. He hinted at comebacks, launched short-lived projects, and talked about forgiveness. But the tide had turned. Even those who once defended him began to see the pattern, the arrogance, the temper, the greed. And yet, the tragedy wasn't just his fall. It was the wreckage left behind. Hundreds of people who once called Harvest home walked away from church altogether, disillusioned. For them, the man who had claimed to speak for God had proven that charisma without character is a weapon. The church that once echoed with songs of victory was now filled with silence, repentance, and grief. Today, James MacDonald lives mostly out of the spotlight. He still claims his innocence. But wherever his name appears, controversy follows. The megachurch he built is still standing, smaller, quieter, humbled. Its leaders speak more about accountability now, about transparency, about how easily trust can be destroyed. MacDonald's story is not just about hypocrisy. It's about how spiritual authority, when unchallenged, can become spiritual tyranny. He preached generosity, but lived in excess. He demanded sacrifice, but built comfort. He spoke of humility, but wielded pride like a crown. And in the end, the same pulpit that elevated him became the place of his undoing. Because when a preacher's life and his message no longer align, the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how loud the sermons, no matter how bright the lights. James MacDonald once stood on stage calling people to surrender everything for God. Today, his story stands as a warning that no amount of passion or polish can save a ministry built on power instead of purity, and that the higher a man climbs without humility, the harder the fall when the truth finally comes to light.